So we are back on the YouTube channel. Today I wanted to talk to you about how much volume do we need to build the most muscle mass. The first thing I need you all to understand, you can only do what you can recover from. So when you are going into the gym, you can literally train until the death. You can train 12 hours a day if you want to. However, how much of that work will you actually be able to recover from, therefore be able to come into the gym and have progress and be able to actually make a solid progression with your volume, your sets, your load, your reps, or your range of motion. If you are going into the gym and you're just doing work for sake of work, the likelihood is that you're not going to actually create any constructive or productive stimulus on the muscle. So first point I need you to understand is you can only do what you can recover from. Once you have that understanding, then we can move on and break things down a little bit deeper so you gain a deeper understanding of what you need to make the most progress that you physically can out of your time in the gym. Let's understand training volume and what it actually means. Your training volume is the total number of hard working sets. Now, one factor that people mostly overlook is that the training volume is not just made up from the number of sets that you actually do. The training volume increases as your load increases, as you actually increase your range of motion, and as you increase your training intensity and accuracy. So the harder you train, the more accurate you train, the more range of motion to a degree you actually use, your training volume actually increases. So one thing you have to understand is that your training volume tolerance is going to vary up and down across stages of your journey. Now, referring back to the point of you can only do what you can recover from, when you see a slower rate of progression in the gym and often see lifts stall, it may actually be that you are under recovered. So you may actually need a deload, or that your training volume is a little bit too high for your recovery capabilities. So your training volume is actually going to be fluid and it will vary up and down based off where you are in your journey. Whether you're in a gaining phase or a diet phase, your training volume will have to modulate up and down as your training age increases. Another factor you have to consider, guys, the more muscle tissue you carry, the stronger you get, the more advanced you get. At times, your training volume will have to come down in order for you to see continuity and progression, because what you can actually get out of one single set versus what you could get out of 2 working sets previously is going to completely shift the stronger you get and the more accurate you get with your training execution. And this comes with training age. The longer you train, the better you get at training, which means that your training volume and your total number of working sets inevitably may have to come down in order for you to see more progress. Your training volume has to be fluid. There will be instances where you can actually get away with more training volume, and there will be instances where you need less training volume. Now, to give you some examples, guys, if you are constantly going to the gym and you are sore to the point where you're not able to progress your lifts, your training volume may need to come down. If you are going to the gym and you never really feel like you've worked hard and you're seeing huge training progression across your lifts and loading progressions, that may be a sign that you can get away with actually adding some more training volume in place. So the way I like to structure things, guys, is when you are in a surplus and you feel fresh, your recovery's on point, you can trial adding some extra sets, extra hard working sets into your program and see where the progression takes you. But again, you have to understand that your training volume needs to be fluid and it will need to come up and down depending on what stage you are in at that moment in time and depending on your recovery capabilities. One thing you have to understand is what actually makes up your total training volume is your sets, your range of motion, your tempo, and your training execution. All these factors actually make up your total training volume. And the better you get across all these factors, the more training volume you actually have directly without adding extra number of sets. So one thing you have to understand is, guys, if you find yourself that all of a sudden you've improved your execution, improved your range of motion, sometimes you may need to scale back the training volume in order to see more progression, because that in itself will see your training volume increase. Therefore, effectiveness of each rep and set will increase tenfold and actually give you more out of less. Now, understanding how much sets you actually need per body part in a single session, as a rough guide, guys, I will give you a number of 4 to 8 working sets per body part is probably max what you can actually recover from. And again, that number will actually come up and down depending on what body part it actually is. and depending on your exercise selection and your program as a whole. So this is where you have to really take consideration training volume as a whole to understand how much training volume you actually need. And you have to understand that it's not just the number of sets that makes up your total training volume. So you have to make sure that you apply yourself in the gym, try and get the most out of least, because that way, if you start with your training volume lowered, you always have an opportunity to actually increase it. And starting off with your training volume on the lower side also gives you an opportunity to see great progression. Whereas if you actually start with maxing out your training volume and you don't see any progression, that in itself can be actually quite demoralizing, and it can actually drive fatigue to a place where you actually make less progress, or even to a degree you start to regress, which is not what we want to do when we try and do which is not what we actually want to do when we actually commit to training in a gym. We all want to grow muscle tissue and we all want to maximize our gains. So you have to be strategic with what you do and how you actually do it. Now, let's talk about rep ranges. Now, this is a factor that I want to finish off on because it really ties us into the training volume talk. And rep ranges that you should aim to work at is anything between 6 to 20 reps if your goal is hypertrophy. Now, certain lifts you will actually want to keep your rep range slightly lower. So big compound lifts like the hack squat, any squat pattern or any deadlift patterns, you don't really want to be going above 10 to 12 rep range, because the likelihood of you being able to keep great execution going into such high rep ranges with a big compound lift like this is very slim, unless you have tremendous endurance, which most bodybuilders simply do not have. So we have to understand that your rep ranges will vary depending on the exercise that you are actually going to do. Now, my preference is to actually work in slightly higher rep ranges with all the isolation exercises. So any single joint movement, I actually prefer working rep range between 10 to 20 repetitions. Now, any compound lifts, my rep range is actually preferred anything between 6 up to a maximum 10 to 12 repetitions. If you are able to take it there for 10 to 12 and not allow your form to break down, then do so. However, the stimulus to fatigue ratio really gets skewed as you start to go into higher rep ranges with multi-joint compound lifts. Therefore, I definitely do not advise that, guys, if you want to keep quality of the work super high. Now, secondly, guys, always prioritize quality over quantity. That is the biggest factor you have to consider, and make sure that your rep ranges also match your fuel intake. And what I mean by that, guys, is as you get into a contest prep, your fuel intake comes down. As your fuel intake comes down, your rep ranges also need to be modulated to match your fuel intake. So the less calories come in, keep your ranges somewhat moderate across the board, even isolation work where you work with 8 to 12 repetitions. As your fuel intake gets higher in the off-season setting and you have an abundance of calories to work from, that is your opportunity to actually work in higher rep ranges to be able to capitalize on extra fuel intake that you do have in place. Now, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Now you know how much volume you may need to maximize muscle gain, guys. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you want to inquire on my exercise program to learn more, please apply below and we can all learn together and get huge together. So guys, thanks so much for now. Please like, share, subscribe, and peace out for now.